Welcome to Geopolitical Horizons, the podcast from the geopoity.com. My name is Yusuf and I'm an analyst at the Geopoity. As the Chinese Communist Party celebrates its 100th year anniversary on the 1st of July, China's officials are going to great lengths to hammer home the message that the CCP alone can restore China to what Beijing considers the country's rightful place as a global power. China today is vastly different to the era in which the CCP emerged. In fact, the Chinese nation itself is very different to where it was not just when the CCP emerged in 1921, but to where it was just a few decades ago. This history is what the CCP is going to great pains to show the Chinese people that the CCP has not just saved China, but only the CCP can navigate China to a position of global dominance. Here to discuss this issue with me today is Geopolity founder Adnan Khan. How are you doing, Adnan?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. So I think the best place to start would be the birth of the CCP and where China was as a nation at the time.
So thanks, Yusuf. I think that's a good place to start. So the situation when the Chinese Communist Party emerged is quite important. It's actually part of their narrative and their legitimacy. So in 1921, when the Chinese Communist Party emerged, the country was going through what they call their century of humiliation. Now, this began in 1839, and it began with the British Empire turning up to their shores and demanding trading privileges, which the Emperor of China wasn't prepared to give. This led to a 2-year war, and a very backward China facing an industrialized Britain found that it was in no position really to take on the might of the British Empire. So the Chinese emperor was forced to give privileges, and this is actually how Hong Kong came into British hands for so long. And what this did really, it opened the floodgates for the rest of the European colonialists to come. So the French, the Germans, the Belgians, the Dutch, the Americans and the Russians, and then eventually the Japanese, all of them started taking pieces of China for the next century. So when the CCP emerged in 1921, the Qing dynasty, the emperor had fallen, and China really had fallen into the hands of various warlords. And it was in this situation that Mao Zedong, he established the Chinese Communist Party. So the origins of the Communist Party was when China was in chaos, when China was, if there was such a term at the time, it was being balkanized. That was the situation in which China emerged. So the narrative of the Communist Party has been until today that it brought an end to the centre of humiliation, and it was a Communist Party that got rid of the colonialists that had taken over China's ports and humiliated them. Now the Chinese believed that for centuries, for millennia actually, they were a great power, and they fell behind due to the industrialization of Europe. So for 100 years, they were in decline. So they now feel that now they're back and they're just getting back to their rightful place where they were before industrial European colonialists actually turned up. So this was the birth, this was the situation that the Communist Party emerged in 100 years ago.
The Communist Party are going to great lengths to show that they are a unique party. They're not like any other dominant party like the Tories in the UK or the Republicans in the US. What makes them unique, as the Chinese Communist Party keeps highlighting?
So you're absolutely right. The Chinese Communist Party is a very unique party. We don't really have a party like it in the world. And what makes them unique is the government and all the civil service, the bureaucracy, is actually a part of the Communist Party. So if you take the example of the UK, the Tory party, the Conservative Party, the Labour Party get elected. They take up their positions in cabinet. They then allocate their heads of the different departments. The media, the largest companies, the think tanks, these are all independent organizations. They have nothing to do with the government. In the case of the Communist Party in China, the organs of the party go into every organized part of society. So the media, universities, education, these are all actually a part of the Communist Party. So the actual running of the country isn't just a function of a political party, it's actually part of the internal workings of the Chinese Communist Party. So if I was to give an example, if the Communist Party of China existed in the UK, then what would happen is the appointment of the entire government cabinet, the government ministers, the heads of the ministerial departments, the heads of the non-ministerial departments, their deputies, all the mayors of the major cities and regulatory bodies would be chosen and appointed by the Communist Party. The top 100 companies in the UK would also be, their directors would be appointed by the party. So the chief executives of Royal Dutch Shell, HSBC, BP, GlaxoSmithKline, all of them will be appointed by the party. The appointment of the editors of The Sun, the Daily Mail, the Times, the Daily Mirror, the Telegraph, the bosses of all the TV networks, BBC, ITV, Channel 4, would all be appointed by the Communist Party. The appointment of the presidents of Cambridge, Oxford, UCL, Imperial, LSE, and all the other big universities would be appointed by the party. The heads of the think tanks, Adam Smith Institute, Institute for Fiscal Studies, Chatham House, all of them will be appointed by the Communist Party. So what makes this party unique is it's the sole political party of China. There is no competition, there is no opposition. The Communist Party, rather than having elections, what they have is transitions. So every 5 years they have elections, which is an internal thing in the Communist Party. And what happens is the existing leaders transition to a new set of leaders. So even the elections of the Communist Party is a transition rather than a elections that we're familiar with in the West. So the Communist Party also is unique. It's seen as a civilizational party. So what that means is they're not viewed like Labour or the Tory Party, the Republicans, where they are party, they've got a support base, they bring some policies. The Chinese Communist Party is looked upon as a party that represents the civilization of the Chinese people. And that's what makes the Chinese Communist Party very, very unique. I mean, there is no party in the world, or I can think of in the last 100 years, that are seen as representing a civilization and whose organs go into every organized part of society. And this is one of the reasons why the Chinese Communist Party gets things done very quickly. Because it's not a matter of giving a contract to an independent company. It's not a matter of trying to get the right price. When China decides to build a dam, the company that will be making the dam is probably a state-owned enterprise anyway. So it's really an internal working of the Communist Party. And that's what makes it very unique compared to the normal political parties that we're accustomed to.
The Communist Party's claim to fame is the economy, and China today is an industrial monster and the world's largest economy. Depending on how you want to measure an economy, how did they actually achieve this?
So I think the major development of the 20th century, or if not the 21st century, is this question. How has China, a country that was poverty-stricken just 4 decades ago, now become, as you mentioned, industrial monster? It's considered the largest country from a GDP perspective compared to the US. And really, nothing was guaranteed for China. When China emerged after World War II and the communists took control of the country, Mao tried to develop China under communist principles, and this was a complete disaster. He tried the Great Leap Forward in 1958, which was a shortcut to industrialization, and that turned out to be a big disaster. I think it led to the death of about 30 million farmers due to famine. I mean, literally farmers were taken off their farmland to go and work in makeshift factories. Then Mao hit back in the early 60s with the Cultural Revolution. He felt the Communist Party was deviating from communism, and then that led to another unstable period for the Communist Party. Now, when Mao passed away in 1975, a new breed of leaders emerged. So Deng Xiaoping, he emerged as the paramount leader in 1976. And under his leadership, the technocrats from the Communist Party were set with a job to go and look at the state of the country and propose some solutions. And then what they came back with was quite damning. They concluded that communism had been a disaster for the country. they had some stats that China is the largest populated country in the world, but over 90% of their population was in poverty. The production of the country was so low that they had to ration bicycles and fans to the people. So their conclusion was communism being a failure. Propagating communism had to come to an end. Creating revolution around the world needed to come to an end. And then what China needed to do really was focus on internal development, not what was going on around the world. However, the Communist Party realized the skills and the technology needed to develop, they just didn't have. They didn't have the know-how. I mean, for 2 decades after World War II, China literally froze. It was frozen in time. It hadn't moved forward despite all of the instability that happened. So what Deng then did in 1979, he began what's now known as the opening reform. And what this was the gradual opening of China's economy to allow foreign technology, foreign workers. And as we can see today, that's made a massive difference to China. China's gone from one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the richest countries in the world. It's gone from a country that was negligible when it came to global trade to now the largest exporter in the world as well. And there was probably a few key things that were central to this development. The first was the use of special economic zones. What China realized was it's got a massive population. I think it was nearly 1 billion in 1979. But the population was poor and it lacked skills. So it realized that its unique selling point really was its endless supply of labor. Now, they weren't really skilled, but they were cheap. So what they decided was the best way to acquire technology and skills is to get foreign companies to set up manufacturing in China. And China didn't want foreign companies to come into mainland China. On the coastal areas, they created special economic zones where foreign companies could come set up production facilities and make use of the most cheapest labor in the world, even cheaper than Germany, Japan, or Indonesia. So this is when Sony, all the brands as we know, Toyota, eventually Apple, Western firms, they all moved over to China because the labor was so cheap. The condition for making use of such cheap labor was that you have to transfer technology and skills. The other thing that China did was it realized as a massive country, unless it builds infrastructure, roads, railways, telecommunication ports, these companies won't be able to trade. So they did what Germany and Japan did originally, which is they built lots of infrastructure to attract foreign companies to come over. And a lot of this infrastructure was actually built from the 1990s onwards. So although China started opening up from 1979 1980, really infrastructure wasn't complete until the late 1990s. And that's why you find China has all the modern infrastructure, but it's only built it in the last 3 decades. The other 2 key things that played a really important role was state-owned enterprises. To make sure certain industries developed, to make sure certain goods were produced that the West would consume, state-owned enterprises led the way. Now, interestingly, these state-owned enterprises, they weren't really profitable. But the aim is if they create jobs, then the 1 billion plus population China has, they'll all be in jobs. And then the other aspect that really aided China was it kept its currency low. By keeping its currency low, it meant goods produced in China were the cheapest in the world. So today, China is a vastly different place to what it was over 4 decades ago. There is poverty in China, but absolutely not the amount that was there 4 decades ago. China today has wealth. China's barren cities have now turned into thriving metropolis urban centers. Many people moved in the hundreds of millions from the rural areas to the urban areas. And that's why today people can't get enough of China. And that's why it's understandable why people are considering China potentially a future power. Because if you look, China has economically developed, and that's why it's taken serious now in the world.
I think everyone would agree that this is an incredible achievement from being one of the poorest countries in the world to a very strong economic nation. What model of economic development would you say China actually followed? Is it truly a communist model? Would it compete with capitalist economy?
So yeah, this is quite an interesting point. Everybody's trying to label China's development with some sort of label. Some people call it communist, some people call it capitalist, some people call it state-driven capitalism. And I think it's important we look at this from the Chinese perspective, because what were they trying to achieve and what was the role of ideology? Now, communism was accepted by the late 1970s to have been a failure for China. China's economy was in the dumps, it hadn't moved forward. So when Deng Xiaoping took over, and Deng Xiaoping, he's famous for once saying that it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. And what that meant is it's not about communism, it's not about capitalism, it's not about ideology. Whatever policy works, we should use it. And that was what drove China's open reform era. So you find the open reform era was the reform of China. And this was a very gradual process which was highly managed by the Communist Party. And what the Communist Party would do, they will trial things at a local village or town level. If they were successful, then they would roll them out at a national level. So to give an example, the special economic zone first started, I believe, 1980, 1981 in a couple of small towns in the Guangdong province. And because they were successful, they were then scaled up and rolled out across the country. So you find that the Communist Party, there were no communist or capitalist considerations when they were deciding economic policy. They weren't thinking we need a free market, does it need to be centrally driven, how do we distribute wealth, what does different ideologies say. That wasn't really a concern for them. Their concern was, we've got 1 billion people who are living in poverty and our economy lacks the capacity for them to have sufficient consumption. So their view was, we need to increase production, we need to get people into factories, we need to process raw materials, we need to turn these into finished goods so their people can consume, and then these goods can be exported abroad, which will bring in revenue for the country. So as far as China was concerned, their model of economic development, you could argue, has similarities with what's called the Southeast Asian model. And what these were is you become export-driven economies. And we saw this with Japan, you saw this with Taiwan, you saw this with South Korea, where what they did was they focused on processing raw material, and it was all about exports to the Western markets. And over time, they developed an expertise in particular areas. So you look at Taiwan, it's semiconductors, you look at Japan, it was electronics. And even today, I think microchips is the area where Taiwan is dominant in. So yeah, when it comes to a model of economic development, China just took bits and bobs from everywhere. As long as it worked, they weren't really too fussed. So obviously this is a major departure from what Mao was trying to do. And it's a major departure from capitalist or communist principles, where your development is in line with your ideological beliefs. That's not what happened in the case of China from 1979 onwards.
Adnan, where does the Belt and Road Initiative fit into China's economic development?
So the Belt and Road Initiative gets a lot of media attention. It has grabbed the interest of the West because of its scale and size. And I think some of its purpose gets missed purely because of its scale and its size and the fact that, you know, it's a project to really link the whole of Eurasia. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative really came about 2010-11, and then it was formally announced by the regime in 2014, I think just soon after Xi Jinping took over. So what this means, the Belt and Road Initiative was already being designed and constructed well before Xi Jinping was even a senior cabinet member. So 2008 or 9, you had the global economic crisis. And this had a major impact on China because China would export to the Western world. That was its main market. That was driving its economy. Now, when the economies of the West went into recession, their imports from China drastically reduced, and that created a massive problem in China. You've got factories that aren't producing what they were producing before. That meant the factories had to reduce staff, which would cause a major problem in China. So what the Communist Party did was they put a lot of stimulus money into the economy, and this found its way into real estate. So lots of construction of real estate and whole towns took place, which are ghost towns. They're literally sitting there empty. This is how they kept the economy ticking over. By 2011, the Communist Party realized you can't keep this going indefinitely. You're literally creating ghost towns. You're overproducing. Your people can't even consume it. But the problem they had to deal with, and they come to the conclusion, is that their own population cannot consume everything that comes off their production line because they're not rich enough. But also China was overproducing. The whole world couldn't produce the amount China was producing. So what China needed to do was shift to a new economic model, shift to a model of economic consumption primarily from its own population. However, it found it couldn't do that at that moment in time. So what they come up with was the expansion of this export model to beyond China. And this is where the Belt and Road Initiative came. And this now meant China's excess steel, its iron, by moving its production facilities and supply lines abroad, it now meant that China's export model wasn't just fixed in China, it was going to Central Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia. When this was announced, many people saw it as a global power grab. What China's going to try and do is take over the rest of the world. That's not how China sees this. What China sees is it needs to link other countries to China in order that these countries consume what China produces, because its own population can't do that. So we've seen lots of infrastructure being developed in Central Asia, in Europe, in Africa. We've seen lots of oil processing plants being built, and a lot of the West get fearful when they see this because they see this as a power grab. So a lot of fingers are pointed at China, that you're indebting countries, even though the West has already indebted most of the world. So this was really the context in which the Belt and Road Initiative came about. So it's really to keep China's economic model going. It's not really a power grab. That's not the aim China has with this.
Now, there's a lot of talk about China becoming a leader in technology. How technologically advanced is China, and what areas do they actually lead in?
Okay, so China has had grand ambitions to be a technological leader going back centuries. China believed that for centuries it was ahead of everybody else. So especially when it came to silk, porcelain, these sort of things, China was a global leader. Other countries used to do industrial espionage in China to learn these skills. Then you saw the rise of Europe, you saw industrialization, and China really fell behind them. So even during the communist era, China had grand ambitions to be some sort of technological leader. Now, up until now, the areas China has excelled in has not been in new technologies. It's been in manufacturing, electronics, textiles, and all the machines and the objects like mobile phones that we're used to using. Now, these technologies are a couple of decades old. They're not actually new. So from that perspective, what China's done is mastered existing technologies. Really only now it's got a plan to try and be at the forefront of the next generation of technologies. So in AI, you see China has some sort of lead because this is based upon computing processing power. And China has focused a lot over the decades in producing the most powerful computers in the world. The other area where China excels in is in space. China has always had ambitions for space. It's landed a probe on the moon, on the dark side of the moon. It's got plans to send Chinese astronauts to Mars in the next 2 to 3 decades. Apart from these two areas, what you find, China's really at the early stage at excelling. So you find on the 5G side of technology, China hasn't invented anything new. But because China can produce the technology for 5G the cheapest, that's why other countries are interested in it. When it comes to innovation and new technologies, China is only now beginning to join the game. Up until now, China's whole drive has been to become self-sufficient and to produce the items that create wealth in their country. So that's why you'll find massive industrial plants across China. You'd find industrial plants that consume lots of energy. But all of these are existing technologies. Some of these are like 5 to 6 decades old. It's now China, so it's got this project called Made in China 2025. And what that is by 2025, China wants to be producing using local components about 40% of everything it produces. And by 2050, its ambition is to get that to 70%. Now, these are very ambitious targets. But nevertheless, it shows that China does want to become a technological leader. So it's got the ambition, but the means to get there, it doesn't really have across the board. It's got it in 1 or 2 areas. So China projects it projects an image that it's a technological leader. And because most electronics and goods that the world consume are made in China, there's an assumption that China is a leading technological power. But you find all the cutting edge technology really is in the West. It's in the US, it's in Europe. It's not really in China. Only in two areas. You're finding that in quantum computers and some areas when it comes to space, you're finding China is now catching up and even leading.
Now, China has been developing its military over the last few decades, and it's now getting a lot of attention from the world. What are the military capabilities? How has its military evolved from the communist era?
So China's military has come a very long way. China's military was based upon having more soldiers than the enemy has bullets. The doctrine of the Chinese military was the People's War, where they've got an endless supply of troops. So if anybody invades their country, they'll get consumed by the sheer numbers China has. Now, these troops weren't particularly well equipped. China didn't really focus on its navy and its air force. In fact, even today, China still uses many fighter jets from the 1950s that it copied from the Soviet Union. But things began to change in 1990. Firstly, the Soviet Union collapsed. And then also the Iraq War was a big eye-opener for China. The first Iraq War in 1991, it saw America use technology to defeat the Iraqi army. And the Iraqi army was still organized on Soviet lines, where you have lots of troops who are not particularly well equipped. Now, the Chinese military was still based upon that same doctrine. So when the Iraqi army was annihilated, the Communist Party concluded that it needs to reform its military. Its military is not fit for purpose. Secondly, the Soviet Union had collapsed and the threat from Russia wasn't what it used to be. So China realized that its military is for a foregone era. China now needs to reshape its military for a new era. And so what we've seen really from the 1990s onwards is China's realized that it doesn't need a massive ground force. So it reduces ground force quite a lot. And really what it needs to do to project power, it needs an air force and navy, and especially needs the navy now because it needs to protect its supply routes for its exports, which are central to its economy. So the area that has developed the most when it comes to the military for China has actually been the air force, and you've seen a lot of the old jets being replaced by modern jets, and it's the navy. So China's navy gets a lot of media attention because this is seen as a threat to America. So China now has more naval vessels than the US does. So literally China's military has shifted from being primarily ground focused to now being air and sea focused. And this China believes will give it the power projection it needs. And this is what also China believes is what's necessary to defend China today with the modern threats they actually faces. China's also excelled a lot in the cyber realm. And because what China concluded was, even when it comes to air and sea, it's going to be a struggle for China to catch up with the US. So China found that the cyber realm was an unorthodox way to reach parity with America. So if America is a global military that is knitted together with military bases via satellites, China's view was if you could infest these satellites with a virus, that would achieve for China what its navy or its air force would need to do. So it's a cost-effective way for it to do it. And that's why all the military reviews in America about China's military, there's always a large section on China's cyber capabilities and what they can achieve.
So now, although China's developing massively, they're getting a lot of negative media attention as well. So we see on the news that there's clearly problems in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the province of Xinjiang. What is going on there, and what does this tell us about China?
So what this really tells us about China is that it can't solve every problem by throwing money at it. It can't solve every problem by building infrastructure over it. So most of China's problems really were economic in origin. The poverty, the lack of wealth, the lack of industry, lack of jobs. China's solved a lot of these sort of issues. But now things which require values, things that require societal cohesion, you're finding China's having a massive problem there. So if we take each of these in turn, Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong was taken off China in 1839 by the British, and it was returned to them in 1997. Now, during that period, Britain created institutions. It made Hong Kong a financial hub in Asia, and it also established financial markets there, the most developed there as well. So when Britain left in 1997, what China found was that the people culturally were Western. They didn't even associate with China anymore. In fact, the people of Hong Kong are Han Chinese, but they actually view themselves as Hong Kongers. They don't even view themselves as Chinese. So China over the years has integrated Hong Kong more and more into China. As it's done that, the people of Hong Kong have started to push back. They literally don't see themselves as Chinese people or communists, as they call it. So what you find is China's having to take a very heavy-handed approach because China doesn't have an ideology. It doesn't have a values that it can call these people to. If you take the United States as an example, it spread across the American continent and it united everyone through its values of freedom, democracy, human rights. China doesn't really have that. And that's why you find it has to take a very heavy-handed approach with its own people. And then that creates a very bad image of China globally. So you find the issues which require soft power values, because China has little of these, it struggles to deal with issues that come as a result of them. So Taiwan's another example. The communists fought the nationalists for ruling over China. They managed to drive the nationalists out from mainland China, who then went and settled in Taiwan. And those nationalists are who established the nation of Taiwan as we know it today. So mainland China has always viewed Taiwan as a rebel province. They've always seen it as part of China. So even China's seat at the UN, they've pushed other countries to recognize China as the ruler over Taiwan. It's part of their foreign policies to ensure other countries don't recognize Taiwan's independence. So over the years, China has been quite aggressive towards Taiwan. It's carried out military exercises. Since its development, it's integrated Taiwan into the economy of China. But public opinion in Taiwan for reintegration with mainland China is literally less than 6%. It's at an all-time low. So again, these are Han Chinese people, but China's struggling to win them over from a values, from an ideological perspective. And it's just another example of China's struggle with things beyond the economy, things beyond development, things beyond infrastructure. And you see a similar problem in Xinjiang. Okay, the Muslims of Xinjiang, they're not Han Chinese, but China has historically struggled with non-Han people. So in effect, the core of China is the coastal areas. And then around China, you've got a ring of non-Han areas. You've got Tibet, you've got Xinjiang, you've got Inner Mongolia, and you've got Manchuria. And you find these regions, when China was strong, it used to rule over them. When China was weak, it would lose them. So China has tried to throw money at the Xinjiang province, but it doesn't work. And again, this is the third example of where China is struggling to deal with a problem because China doesn't have values. And in fact, even Chinese culture, the Chinese believe this is not universal, unique to them. So they're struggling to deal with societal type issues because on this front, they've got absolutely nothing. They've got no ideology, they've got no values whatsoever. And they're realizing the hard way, you cannot just economically plan your way through these issues. It requires you to win hearts and minds. And winning hearts and minds requires you to show the superiority of your ideas, the superiority of your organization of society. So it's a lot more than economics. And this is why really, once you go beyond economics, you see China actually has some significant problems and challenges.
So going on from there, we're finding all these challenges that China faces with social cohesion, with integrating their population. However, the Chinese party, the Communist Party, is trying to paint a picture that the Communist Party has built China up and everything is good in China. What are the key areas that China is lacking or needs to improve in?
Okay, there's actually quite a few areas that China needs to really have a look at. The first thing is China really developed on the back of the global liberal order, which is dominated by the US. So China joined the World Trade Organization, if I remember, in 1999-2000. China exports to the world. So it's actually part of the global system. The problem is the global system is dominated by the US. So China struggled really for the moment to decouple from this US-based system. So the trade war has had a big impact on China, because what America is doing is putting sanctions on Chinese imports. So the number one country China exports to is the US. It's its number one partner, but it also is its main competitor. It's the country that's threatened by China's rise. The other area where China really lacks is values. When the Soviet Union existed, it had a different way of organizing society. It had in mind a different order for the world. As a result, it promoted this to the world, it projected it, and it won over many people from the West. China has none of this. China's not even engaged in this struggle anymore. So you're finding China wants to invest in countries. China wants to build infrastructure in countries, but beyond that, it's got nothing to offer them. So all the countries China is investing in, these are countries that are very, very close to America and the European countries. So the lack of values means China really is struggling to get other countries to see the world the way it sees it, and to attract other countries to a China-based system which doesn't exist at the moment. And what this really leads to is, on the political front, China really doesn't engage in political struggle. So China doesn't really engage in political struggle around the world. You find it doesn't try to propose alternative solutions to the world's problems, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Africa, or on all of these sort of key global issues. China really doesn't play a role. And a lot of that is because China's foreign policy is very economic driven. It's not really driven by politics. So really China, the way it's going at the moment, is going down the Japan and Germany route, where these countries became economic powers, but little more than that. They didn't really become any more than that, really. They had no alternative political strategies for the different problems in the world. So the Soviet Union competed with America by proposing different solutions for the world's problems. Now, you'll find also under Donald Trump's presidency in America, for 4 years, Donald Trump upset his own allies. And you find China was unable to take advantage of this. China was unable to win over the countries that he had upset. He upset mostly his own allies. I mean, he treated his enemies, Trump, better than he did his allies. If you look at the way he treated Angela Merkel of Germany, the Japanese leader, the South Korean leader, the Canadian leader, China, again, wasn't able to take advantage of this, because on the political front, it really has a lack of experience. It has a lack of direction. It's unable to compete with America on these areas. You'll also find that China doesn't have an alliance of agent rulers, a vassal system. America has Pakistan, it has Egypt, it has Australia, it has India. Across the world, it's got agent rulers. It's brought people to power who rely on America's support to be in power. China has none of that. In fact, the countries China is economically the closest to, these are some of the countries that are the deepest in an alliance system with America. And again, this comes back down to the lack of political ambition by China. It doesn't have the know-how, and it doesn't even have the ability or the capability to engage in this particular area. So if it was to militarily take over Taiwan, that would be a political move. That would send shockwaves through the system. That would now mean China is now prepared to act when it comes to its interests. But China even knows today, if it invades Taiwan, it's not actually fighting the Taiwanese army. Its real threat is the US army. And at the moment, in its own region, its biggest threat isn't even Japan, North Korea, or Australia. It's actually a country that's not even in the region. It's actually America. So all of these issues, you know, a new global system, the lack of values, the lack of politics, being economic driven, all of these are areas China really needs to improve in if it really wants to make its mark on the world.
In a previous podcast, we discussed the Global Trends Report, which stated that one of the possible future outcomes for the world is a divide between the US and China. Everyone believes it's actually a matter of time before China actually replaces the US. How accurate is this?
So my personal opinion, Yusuf, is I think this is very far off. I think it's actually unlikely to emerge that way. And I say this for a few reasons. I think to replace America, it's not just about replacing America, the country. You've got to replace all the tools America has established to institutionalize its global position. At the moment, China is very, very far from that. America established a global order. So if you look at global trade, global finance, its own currency, these are the standards for the world. America's military is far and above ahead of all the world's militaries combined. So if you're going to replace America, you need to weaken America's tools. And at the moment, I feel China doesn't just lack the ability and capability. I believe China actually lacks some of the political foresight to even achieve this. And I think some of this is also because China is really more focused towards developing its internal situation, developing the economy, strengthening the economy, establishing it. Then it could potentially look beyond its shores. At the moment, the Communist Party is mostly focused on all the things within its borders and the things that affect it. So yes, what happens with trade around the world, China is interested in, but that's because global trade is so important to its economy. It relies on global trade for the functioning of its economy. Also, usually power shifts when there's some sort of war. So World War II was when the global power shifted. The British Empire came to power and it lasted over wars. At the moment, I can't see how China will engage in a war with a global power. I mean, every era somebody says this and then a war happens. But I think the important thing here is yes, China has ambitions to be a power. In its own way, that doesn't necessarily mean replacing America. I mean, China doesn't want the responsibility of America. They doesn't want to run the world. What China is because of its civilization, it believes it should be respected. And it believes it should have the elements of power. So a strong economy, a strong military, and the Chinese people should be respected. Yeah, that's what China wants to achieve. Now, you don't need to do that and be a global power. You can do that without being a power. I think if China had values for the world, if China had a system for the world, then it would develop a military and economy in order to achieve it. China doesn't have that. So exactly what the Soviet Union had in terms of communist ideology and its purpose became to propagate it, that is the exact thing China lacks today. So I think China will become a power like Japan, like Germany, but to replace America, I think a lot needs to change really for that to actually happen.
Thank you for your time today, Adnan. If you want to learn more about the issues raised today, please check out our website, www.thegeopoity.com, all one word. You can also learn more on other issues by accessing our website where you can find comprehensive insights. I'm Yusuf, thank you for listening today.